John Martin Tribute, for delivery at his memorial service, 6th July 2026. Thanks to Mary, Ross and Russell for entrusting me with this memorial to John in his working life. We were in the Treasury at the same time for 16 years, from 1964 to 1980, and again at Victoria University for a further 10 years, from 1996 to 2006. He was both a colleague and a friend. Over the last month, the tributes have flowed in from other former workmates, both in the public service and at Vic. They all say the same thing. He was the best of colleagues, a team player, a good boss and thoughtful mentor, a great teacher and collaborator. I can't do full justice here to the breadth and diversity of John's several careers. I was able to mine his own memoir for what follows, but there is much more to be told. I hope that you get a chance to read the memoir. It's testimony to his prodigious memory for people and places. There are some great stories in it. John accidentally leaving a ceremonial woven hat, a gift from Puka Puka for the Governor-General, on his desk overnight, to be collected by the cleaner and consigned to the incinerator. John, clad only in swim trunks on his way to a hotel swimming pool, greeting British Prime Minister Harold Wilson in the lift. John creating a security panic at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in Accra by tripping over a microphone cord so it sounded like a gunshot, and sparking the hurried departure of President Kwame Nkrumah. During his time in Treasury, John represented New Zealand's interests abroad at some crucial turning points in our external economic relations. He also advised on policy for the development of New Zealand industry and agriculture, and was closely involved in policy for wages and prices at a particularly fraught time for labour relations. He was in charge of staffing for the Treasury when we were recruiting many of the best and brightest out of the universities. He was seconded from Treasury to be director of the New Zealand Planning Council, before being shoulder-tapped for a deputy's job in the old Department of Health. In his 7 years in health, he had to deal with a complete reorganisation of the governance and funding of public hospitals, a bitter confrontation with the unions over hospital pay, the impact of the PC revolution on health computing, the emergence of HIV/AIDS, and the Cartwright inquiry. Internally, he led a management review that effectively ended the monopoly that doctors had on the senior positions. He says that moving from the protected environment of the Treasury to a large service department made him a better public servant and broadened his knowledge of public administration. At Victoria University, both his students and his academic colleagues valued his ability to set theory of policy and administration in the context of his real-world experience. John's public service career started at age 17. In 1952, he was still a sixth former at Rongotai College when he went down with his mum to the Public Service Commission to be interviewed for a cadetship. In those days, it was still very common to start in a government department straight out of school. If you were bright, like John, the public service would send you to university. You might start off part-time and then get full-time leave to complete your degree, and maybe even, again like John, go on to postgraduate work. John may well have thought then that he would retire 40-odd years later with his government super to tend to his garden and help look after the grandkids. In 1953, a government department was a career for life. You joined the public service expecting that it would look after you, see that you got the most out of your career. There was always the sense for John that somebody was looking out for him, for his education, but also for his learning on the job. He is generous about his mentors, at school and university and in the public service. They coached and encouraged him, set him tasks to challenge and develop him, let him have his head, and supported him with advice and encouragement when he needed it. He came to regard that as an essential role for anyone in charge of younger and aspiring staff. It was the way that a public service or a university could regenerate itself. John clocked in at the old Department of Island Territories in early 1953, straight after the summer holidays. He served his early apprenticeship in accounts, where he says he learned the disciplines of office life and got on with university study part-time. The department head, Jock McEwen, arranged for a secondment to Samoa. In Apia, barely 21, he found himself as clerk of the Executive Council, working to the likes of Fiame Mata'afa and Tofilau Eti Alasana, both future prime ministers in an independent Samoa. He wrote his thesis on local governance in Samoa during the mandate, which surely must have touched on the central constitutional issue of the place of Whāamatai in a constitutional democracy. When Frank Corner and Colin Aikman were working on the Samoan Independence Plan in External Affairs, John worked with them as the Island Territories desk officer. He describes himself as the dog's body, but it was clear how much he soaked up in working to these two brilliant minds. He says himself that he saw with admiration how Frank's drafting could bring focus and direction to policy talk. He honed his own skills at working through issues and taking them forward in his long-time work on our external economic relations. In fact, his career after Island Territories might have been in diplomacy. Frank, who went on to be Secretary of External Affairs, told him there was always a place there for him. But Henry Lang, our mutual boss in Treasury, snaffled him first. Treasury gave him the opportunity to develop his skills there through working parties here, delegations overseas, and 2 overseas postings in London and Geneva. John was part of delegations to international organizations and worked on our membership of the OECD. But the issue that dominated his early career in international relations was probably Britain's accession to the EEC and the effect it had on NZ's trade with the UK in butter and lamb. There he gained the admiration not only of his colleagues, but of those on the other side of the negotiations. Some of the British team conceded that the New Zealand delegations were better informed than they were about production and trade in British agriculture. John played his part in giving us this reputation as skilled negotiators. And of course, there was his passion for cricket that was threaded throughout his working life. There were few places where he visited or lived abroad where he didn't make some contact with the sport, either as a player or a spectator. He never sacrificed his work to his cricket, but sometimes they seemed thoroughly intertwined, whether it was watching the West Indies-England Test at Lord's with Jim Moriarty from Industries and Commerce, or playing for the London New Zealand Cricket Club with John Marshall, later PM, but then Minister for Overseas Trade. He took great pride in being made a member of the MCC, the godhead of English cricket. Nothing to do with his diplomatic status in London, he says. The contest, the team spirit, and the old-fashioned sportsmanship of cricket in those halcyon days of the red ball and white flannels, unadorned with sponsorship logos, were values that he reflected in his professional life. John thrived in the small groups of advisers working together to develop policy, which could then be translated into action. He was a swift, concise, and meticulous drafter. John's edits of my own prose were sometimes deflating, but always educative. He also saw how one could take effective control of an agenda by taking responsibility for summarizing the outcome of working meetings. Joanna Tuckwell said that, many years later, when John was chairing the Animal Ethics Advisory Committee, She admired his ability to do exactly that, put words on paper to move things along to the next step, which is the essence of policy process. John's close engagement with officials from external affairs and trade and industry on trade issues also bred in him a lifelong conviction in the strength of the officials' committee system for advising cabinet. He recognized that officials would not always agree, but was firmly of the view that differences on what to say to ministers should be worked out through this system. In Treasury, John worked on many other topics besides trade policy, like farm subsidies, petrochemical investments, or incomes policy. They were issues where official advice was much more sharply divided than on our trade relations. It was tempting to fall back into trench warfare, firing off reports across the barricades via our minister. John was always at pains to say that we might argue strongly on policy, but other departments were not Treasury's tribal enemies. He believed that we were all working to make sure that ministers understood the choices they had to make and their consequences. It was a tangible expression of the principle that the values of the public service transcended departmental boundaries. In his memoir, John gives a lot of space to the people he worked with. He was a team player in all his working relations. It reflected his outgoing nature and his capacity for making friendships that extended beyond the workplace. The talkativeness we all remember was just part of that. The eagerness to reach out, to greet people, the open smile, the deep, strong baritone voice. As for the talk, I worked out early on that the best thing to do was just interrupt him after a while. He would cheerfully acknowledge that he was running on a bit. Sometimes he records his surprise at the abilities people saw in him. He wondered why Henry Lang would want to hire him when he didn't have an economics degree. That was simple, Henry said. You can write. He was so surprised when he was made an assistant secretary that he actually bailed up Henry about it. Henry just replied, no doubt with a grin, I can see him, that it wasn't John's choice to make. He wondered why he had been tapped by the State Services Commission to go to health and administer this large bureaucracy dominated by doctors. It came as a complete surprise. Margaret Baisley said that he brought a new energy to the top team and brought the Treasury curiosity, attention, discipline and focus to our work. When Margaret Clark offered him the fellowship position at Victoria, he said that he didn't do research, only reflections. I'm guessing that Margaret thought what a contribution his experience of the actual world of administration could make to the teaching and writing about it. The tributes of his colleagues at Victoria are testimony to Margaret's insight. John left the public service from the health department in 1988 to academic life at Victoria. He was 52, 8 years short of what he might have expected as the Rongotai College boy in 1953. Early retirement was symbolic of how much his working world had changed over 35 years. My generation of public servants tend to focus on the great singularity of the Douglas era, the State Sector Act of 1988, and the conquest of the public sector by ideas of management taken from the private sector. John recognized that the change had been going on long before that. Very few of the young graduates that John helped recruit for Treasury expected to be there until age 60. In the big bureaucracies like health and education, senior managers were being recruited and trained for their skills in management. The management reforms of the 1980s worried him. His fear was that the sense of a unified career service was being lost, that a narrowly vertical accountability of chief executives to their ministers would erode the values and culture of the old public service, the one he grew up in. Jonathan Boston refers particularly to John's moral compass and passion for good governance. It was a constant theme in his teaching and writing at university, and it led him to writing and advising on standards in public service, including a stint on the State Sector Standards Board. At Victoria, John wrote extensively about public policy and administration. The book he co-authored with Jonathan Boston, June Pallett and Pat Walsh was almost a textbook for me in my own teaching. He never got to write the history of the public service he wanted. The closest he got was his book, Spirit of Service, his history of the Institute of Public Administration, with which he had a close association over many years. But he developed these themes of its values and standards in many of his essays and lectures. He was particularly proud of a short collection of essays called A Profession of Statecraft. It's a particular vision with a strong influence from the British senior civil service of a class of administrators with the experience and the training to both advise the government and take on the tasks it assigns them. It was aimed at breeding a cadre of senior public servants carrying the values that he thought so important. They would do so not as managers narrowly focused on their departments, but as a collectivity with a commitment to the wider interests of the government as a whole. John called his memoir A Boy from Seatoun, probably because he was a committed Wellingtonian and that's where he's from. I'd be speculating to give it any deeper meaning, but there are some clues. One is his memory of walking down Whitehall with Lloyd White from External Affairs and a very senior British Mandarin, both very tall and both in bowler hats and carrying tightly furled umbrellas. It struck him then, he says, that he was a long way from Seatoun. Maybe this was in the back of his mind when he was advising prime ministers or meeting grand figures from other countries, or visiting the hallowed ground at Lord's. Maybe he remembered the institutions and the people that had given him all the opportunities and challenges he had taken on with such relish. And maybe this was why he shared his own knowledge and his experience so generously. There is a lasting legacy of the man that the boy from Seatoun became, in his writing, but also in the memories of the many people he worked with who knew him as their workmate or teacher, but also as their friend.